Sometimes fate writes the most impossible reunions. She spent her life saving strangers, but that day, she saved two people who once pretended she was dead. And what came after? You'll want to see it through to the end. It was a spring night in Millbrook, but the chaos of the earthquake erased any trace of the season. Overturned cars, fallen poles, shattered storefronts, the scent of dust still hung in the air, and the ground still trembled beneath Captain Grace Williams' boots, a 25-year-old black woman, as she pushed through the rubble of the antique store. The last tremor had taken down half the block, and the muffled groans beneath the debris were the only compass she had. "There are people alive in here!" "Adi," she shouted without hesitation. With a flashlight strapped to her forehead, she knelt and reached through a gap in the wreckage. She found a small space and saw two trapped bodies, a man with a dirt-covered face and a woman with a deep cut across her forehead. "Here, I've made visual contact," she called to her team. "We need to cut through these beams. Now." Beneath layers of wood, dust, and broken concrete, the couple waited in silence. The woman trembled. The man tried to stay calm. They were hurt but conscious, clinging to each other. Both of them sensed this wasn't just a physical rescue. The life they had built, the lies they had carried for 2 decades, were about to collapse. Margaret turned her head with difficulty. Through the dust and the flashlight's beam, she managed to glimpse the face of the young firefighter. For a moment, their eyes met, and she knew. Not through logic, not through proof, but something visceral. "Robert," she whispered. "It's her! It's Grace!" Robert went pale. Outside, the lieutenant continued the rescue with precision. She carried herself like someone born to save lives, but inside, Grace felt something strange, as if those two strangers weren't really strangers at all. "I'm Lieutenant Grace Williams. Hang in there. We're getting you out of here." The man tried to speak but coughed up blood. The woman just stared at Grace, eyes wide open like she was seeing a ghost, and began to cry. Not out of fear, not from pain, but from something much deeper. The daughter they had abandoned was now saving their lives. "You..." Grace didn't hear the rest. The radio crackled with urgent orders. She had to act fast. When the two were finally pulled out and loaded into the ambulance, Grace kept staring. There was something eerily familiar about their faces. An old discomfort. Like she was looking at a piece of a puzzle she never knew she'd been trying to solve. She didn't know it yet, but that morning, among sirens, dust, and chaos, she had just saved the two people who once chose to pretend she didn't exist. In the makeshift triage station set up in the hospital parking lot, Grace walked between gurneys and sirens, assigning tasks and trying to ignore the tightening in her chest since the rescue. She was used to dealing with tragedies, but something about that couple shook her sense of certainty. "Lieutenant Williams," a nurse called. "The couple from the antique store is asking for you." Grace hesitated. "Why?" she asked, not hiding her exhaustion. "The woman said she knows you. Asked to speak urgently." Grace frowned. "Know her? How?" She walked to the cubicle where the two were being evaluated. Margaret had a deep gash, hastily stitched. Robert's arm was immobilized, but the urgency was in their eyes. The woman's eyes filled with tears as soon as she saw Grace approach. Your name is Grace?" Margaret's voice was weak, cracking. "Yes," she answered cautiously. "Grace Williams, why?" Robert closed his eyes. Margaret clutched the edge of the gurney tightly. "We gave you that name." Grace froze. "What?" Margaret took a deep breath. Every word seemed to weigh 100 pounds. "You were born Grace Elaine, and you're our daughter." Time stopped. Everything in Grace rejected that idea. It was impossible, absurd, unthinkable. She stepped back like trying to escape a nightmare, but couldn't. Something inside her, something that had always hurt without a name, began to stir. "No, that makes no sense." Her voice was a mix of disbelief and anger. My parents died before I could talk. That's what I was told." Margaret nodded with pain. "That's what we made everyone believe, including you." Grace felt the ground disappear. "Why?" she asked, tears now streaming. "Why would anyone do that to a child?" Robert finally spoke, his voice low, raspy but steady. "Because we were cowards. Because we cared more about society's opinion than about you." Grace looked at them like she was staring at criminals. "You left me at a hospital and disappeared?" Margaret was sobbing uncontrollably now. "No, we left you at the doorstep of the central fire station, in a basket, wrapped in a blanket, with a note with your full name. I watched from afar, waited until someone found you. And then I ran." Grace covered her mouth with her hand. "The central station, that's where everything had begun, and where, ironically, life had led her back." A nurse discreetly approached with a clipboard. Grace motioned for her to back off. She couldn't leave. Not now. "Who else knew about this?" she asked, voice hoarse. Robert shook his head. "No one, not even your grandmother, not the neighbors. We told everyone that you didn't survive the birth. We hid you at home for 3 months before—" "Why?" Grace asked again. Why go to such lengths to erase a child from your life?" Margaret took a moment to answer, but when she did, her soul came out in pieces. "Because you were born black, and we couldn't handle what that meant back then. In our family, in our society, in our cowardice." Grace struggled to breathe, as if the hospital air had suddenly turned heavier. "But if both of you are white," Margaret nodded. Her tear-filled eyes didn't blink. "Your biological father's name was Marcus. He was a safety officer at the school where I used to teach. We had a brief relationship before I met Robert. I never told anyone the truth, not even him." Robert lowered his gaze. For the first time, he seemed unsure of what to say. "I agreed to raise you and love you as my own," he murmured. "But when you were born, everything fell apart. The color of your skin revealed everything we wanted to hide." The silence that followed was suffocating. Grace looked at them. She didn't see monsters. She saw human beings, too fragile to face their own ignorance, but that didn't make the pain any less real, or the abandonment any easier to bear. She took a deep breath. She needed to leave. She needed to think. "You're alive," she said, as if reminding herself. "And you knew I was too, and you never came looking." Margaret tried to speak, but Grace was already walking out. Each step hurt. But she needed air. Because the truth had finally been spoken, and she had no idea what to do with it. Grace left the room like someone surviving a collapse for the second time. There was no smoke in the hospital hallways, but inside she was in ruins. Every step was a memory she never lived. Every breath was a muffled scream from a childhood with too many unanswered questions. She entered the staff bathroom, locked the door, and looked at herself in the mirror. She stood there for long seconds, just staring. Her uniform was still dusty and stained with dried blood, but now it was the name on her chest that weighed the most. Grace Williams, the only name she'd ever known, the only name that ever made her feel like she belonged. And at that moment, even that name felt foreign. Her adoptive parents, the Williams, had died 2 years ago, a car accident. Overnight she had lost everything she knew as home. And now she had discovered that her biological parents were alive, that they hadn't died in any childbirth, that they knew, and disappeared. She splashed cold water on her face, not to calm down, but to keep from sinking. She remembered the day she joined the fire department. She was 18, the youngest in her class, the only black woman. They told her she wouldn't last, that she was too fragile, but she stayed. And now Now she was the lieutenant who saved lives, of all people, the abandoned daughter. The radio on her belt crackled with updates about the collapse victims. She turned it off. She needed silence. Just this once. Silence. She leaned against the bathroom wall and slid down to the floor and cried for the child who was left behind, for the parents who chose to lie, for the family she built and lost, and for the cruel irony of having found them again, while saving them from death. And it was on that cold hospital floor that Grace understood something more painful than abandonment. Her parents had been alive this whole time, and maybe even the man Margaret tried to erase from the story. Marcus Thompson, her biological father, was still out there somewhere, while she had spent her whole life believing she belonged to no one. Marcus Thompson was at the firehouse, like he always was after major operations, not to lead anything. He was long retired, but just to be there. Ever since Grace had taken over as lieutenant, he liked to stop by now, and then with some excuse, bringing coffee. Checking equipment, reviewing reports, but everyone knew it was because of her. He was proud of that young woman, of her calm under pressure, her natural leadership, the courage that even tragedy couldn't shake. But that morning, when he saw her walk by with lowered eyes and a blank expression, Marcus felt something different. "Lieutenant," he called, his voice firm but gentle. She stopped, breathed, turned slowly. "Good morning, Captain Thompson." He frowned. It had been a while since she used his old title. It was her way of protecting herself. Formality instead of affection. "You doing okay?" Grace hesitated. She could lie, she could say yes, everything was under control, as always. But something about that question, coming from him, made the answer fall out on its own. "No," she said. But I'm trying to be." Marcus nodded. He didn't ask for explanations. He just pulled up a chair beside his. She sat, in silence. Marcus looked at Grace with tenderness. "You remember the first time you walked in here? Braided hair, boots too big, a look in your eyes that said you weren't backing down for anything." Grace gave a faint smile. "I thought you were going to fail me, just by looking at me." He chuckled. "I knew from day one you were different." She looked down. "You always treated me like you'd known me for years." Marcus didn't respond right away, because deep down, that's exactly how it felt, as if some part of him had recognized Grace long before he knew why, as if life had put them on the same path, to heal a void he never knew how to name. Marcus had once been a fire safety technician at the very school where Margaret worked. After she left him, he resigned and joined the fire department, as if trying to put out a fire that had been burning inside him. But not even he, the man who always felt like something had been taken from him too soon, could have imagined that in that very same station, life would return what he never even knew he'd lost. That night, Grace didn't go home. She stayed at the station late, walking in circles through the empty yard. She needed air, silence, and an answer she still didn't know where to find. Eventually, she sat down on the bench near the department's memorial, a block of black stone with the names of all the veterans who had served in that station. She knew every line carved into it, by heart. She'd read them so many times during training. But that night, her eyes stopped on one specific name, and suddenly everything made sense. Marcus Thompson. She stared at the letters as if they were glowing, as if they were saying more than they actually said. Marcus. The name Margaret had whispered. In that hospital room, the man she described as gentle, reserved, passionate about safety and routines. Marcus, her mentor, the only man who looked at her with respect when everyone else doubted, the only one who treated her like a daughter without ever knowing she was. Grace stood frozen. The world spun around her, but inside, everything was still. "It can't be," she murmured. But it was. The dates matched, The background, the school, the sudden resignation. The silence he always kept about the past. Grace felt her stomach turn. She didn't know whether to cry or scream, to run to him or walk away for good. It was like discovering her story had a second half all along, and no one ever told her. She stayed there for hours. No phone, no radio, nothing, just her, the cold bench, and a name carved in stone. The name of the man who'd always been by her side, and who now she didn't know how to face. Marcus arrived at the station late in the afternoon. Grace had asked someone to call him. Without explaining much, she'd simply said, "I need to talk to him, alone." When he stepped into the meeting room, he found Grace standing facing the window. The fading light of day cast her silhouette onto the floor. She didn't turn, she just spoke. "Thanks for coming." "Always," he replied without hesitation. She took a deep breath, like someone who'd been rehearsing for hours. "Before joining the fire department, you worked at a school, right?" "I did," he replied. "At Millbrook Public School. I was a safety technician there." "Did you know a teacher named Margaret?" The name cracked through the air like lightning. Marcus went pale. "I did," he finally said. "Were you two involved?" Marcus pulled back. "I'm sorry, that's a very personal matter." Grace pressed on. "Forgive me if I'm intruding, but it's important," Marcus answered, a little uneasy. "We were involved. It was brief, but real. She left me shortly before getting married, said it was for the best. I never saw her again." Grace nodded, as if everything had finally landed exactly where it belonged. She finally turned around. "She was pregnant when she left you." Marcus froze. "She never told you, not a soul." He sat down slowly, as if his legs could no longer hold what his heart already knew. "It was a girl," Grace continued. "Perfect, but the wrong color. She was left in a basket at the doorstep of this very fire station with a note and a name. The silence that followed was unlike any other. A silence with weight, with history, with pain." Marcus blinked a few times, but didn't speak. "She told everyone the baby died at birth," Grace continued. "But she didn't." He clenched his hands on the table. "How do you know that?" Grace took a moment to answer. The air seemed heavier. "Because that baby is me." Marcus froze. "What? I'm Margaret's daughter. The daughter," she said, "died." Marcus slowly lifted his eyes, but he didn't say a word. Grace stepped closer, her eyes wet, but her voice steady. "I'm your daughter, Captain." Marcus brought a hand to his face, then to his chest. He sat in silence for a long moment, but his eyes said everything. He didn't cry right away, didn't stand, didn't hug her. He just looked at her, like someone who had just recovered a missing piece of themselves. "Grace," he whispered, "you have no idea how much I know," she interrupted gently. "Even without knowing, you've always been there." Marcus closed his eyes. 2 tears slipped free, and when he opened them, she was still there, standing, steady, and finally seen. The reunion happened 2 days later. Margaret and Robert were at home, or what was left of an improvised home. After the earthquake, they had been temporarily relocated to a small apartment loaned by a family friend. Grace knocked calmly on the door. She hadn't warned them. Margaret opened it and froze for a moment. "You came," Grace nodded, serious. "Can I come in?" "Of course," Margaret said, stepping back immediately. Robert was in the living room, his arm in a sling. He tried to stand, but Grace gestured with her hand. "No need. I just came to talk and make a few things clear." They nodded. The air felt like it was made of glass. Grace remained standing. She didn't want to get comfortable. "I found Marcus." Margaret brought a hand to her mouth. Robert simply closed his eyes. "I told him everything. He didn't know, not a thing." "I figured," Margaret whispered. "I was always afraid of what he'd think of me, and what he'd think of you if he ever found out. He's thought about me all along, even without knowing who I was. He stayed. Margaret cried in silence. Robert stared at the floor. Grace went on. I didn't come here to forgive you or to say everything will be okay, because maybe it won't. But I came because I'm tired of carrying a story I didn't choose. She took a deep breath. I grew up believing I was rejected, and now I know I was rejected. Out of fear, out of racism, out of cowardice, and as absurd as it may sound, knowing that brings me peace. Because now I know I wasn't the mistake. Margaret stood up. You were never the mistake, Grace. The mistake was us. Grace took another breath. The mistake can't be undone, but it can be remembered, and I still don't know if I want you to be part of my life. But I want you to know, I'm no longer that helpless baby you left in a basket. Today, I get to choose, and maybe one day, I'll choose to forgive. Robert finally looked up. If that day ever comes, we'll be here. Grace nodded. I hope you are. And turned to leave. Just before crossing the door, Margaret called out softly, Grace? She turned around. Did you find a family? Grace paused for a second. Maybe, and walked away. It looked like just another Sunday lunch. Nothing fancy. Simple dishes, a floral tablecloth, open windows. But there was a weight in the air that even the smell of homemade food couldn't hide. When Margaret and Robert arrived, Marcus was already there. As always, he kept a quiet posture, observing everything with care. The tension was thick, and in the middle of a casual conversation about the weather and the earthquake damage, the doorbell rang. Grace went to answer it and returned moments later, accompanied by David, tall, calm, with the respectful demeanor of someone who knows how to enter without making noise. This is David, she said, placing her hand on his arm. We've been together for almost 2 years. He's a firefighter too. David simply nodded and offered a gentle smile, then pulled out the chair beside Grace and sat down as if he'd been part of the family for years. The conversation began to flow again, but Grace knew why they were all really there. She waited for the plates to clear a little, then leaned slightly forward. I think we all know we're not just here for the food. Silence fell. I arranged this lunch because we need to talk about what happened, about what's still happening. She looked at Margaret and Robert, not with bitterness, but without softening the truth. I know you both have regrets. I know it wasn't easy, but what happened to me wasn't just abandonment. It was a decision based on skin color, and that is racism. Marcus didn't look away. The truth doesn't fade with time, and no one here is seeking revenge. But pretending everything can be rebuilt in silence would just be repeating the mistake. Robert ran a hand over his face. Margaret stared at her plate. You need to tell the truth, Grace continued, to the city, to the family, to the people who believed I was dead for more than 20 years. You want us to give an interview? Margaret asked, uncertain. I want you to own the story. In your words, in your way, but with courage, because this isn't just about me. It's about every child who's been rejected because of the color of their skin. It's about what racism takes from us, even without shouting. Marcus nodded slowly. When we tell the truth, the shame shifts places. David squeezed Grace's hand under the table. Robert and Margaret exchanged a glance. There was no more running. We'll tell it, Robert said, his voice rough. We'll say everything and face the consequences. The conversation continued, more slowly, more gently, and for the first time, that table held not just plates, but a real possibility for the future. It took a week for the text to be ready. Margaret wrote every line with trembling hands. Robert reviewed it, and together they sent it to the website of the local newspaper, the Millbrook Herald. Our daughter never died. We lied because she was born black and we were afraid. Signed by Margaret and Robert Chen, the open letter was short, direct, and left nothing out. The daughter they claimed to have lost at birth had been abandoned out of fear of prejudice. And now, 25 years later, they were ready to tell the truth. It took less than an hour for the news to explode. Soon, social media was filled with headlines like, "The daughter who saved the parents who abandoned her." The comments came quickly. "This sounds like a movie script. How can someone do that to a baby?" At least they had the courage to tell it. That's more than most. Grace Williams is a hero, not just because she's a firefighter. And the racism, will it get swept under the rug again? Grace's name was trending, and accounts from outside Millbrook began sharing her story. At the station, journalists started calling. At the grocery store, two older women approached her with teary eyes and said, "Thank you for staying." But the town had mixed feelings. Some praised the courage, some questioned the motives, some said they were just looking for attention. Grace remained silent. She gave no interviews. She didn't reply to messages, she just watched. And meanwhile, the world around her reacted. At school, a 12-year-old black girl gave a presentation about Millbrook's history and ended by saying, "Now I know that heroes can look like me." Hate doesn't vanish with time, it just changes clothes. That night, Grace found an anonymous note taped to the station door. "You gave me the courage to tell my story too." And in that moment, she understood. Not all rebuilding starts with bricks. Some begin with truth laid bare and hearts that little by little stop hiding. 2 months had passed since the day Grace rescued Margaret and Robert. The request for a public retraction had been accepted, not without hesitation and not without pain. Grace's story was still echoing on social media, in schools, on the corners of Millbrook, and even so, Grace remained quiet, not about the past, but about the future. That Sunday afternoon, she invited everyone back. Tea was set out in the backyard, which now looked different, as if the pieces left by the earthquake had been picked up, one by one. Once everyone had taken their seats, Grace stood. There was something in the way she positioned herself before them that everyone understood, and without a single word, she had something to say. "You know," she began, her voice steady, "all my life I looked for a place where I could belong without having to explain myself, where I could be loved without having to ask." She paused, looked at David, who gave a soft nod, then placed her hands on her belly. "Today, I carry that place inside me." Total silence. Grace was pregnant. Margaret brought her hands to her mouth, unable to hold back her tears. Robert bowed his head, trying to process it. Marcus slowly stood up, his eyes glistening. "Is it a boy?" he asked. Grace laughed softly. "I don't know yet, but I do know he's going to have a different story than mine. No silence, no shame, no lies." She stepped toward a spot in the yard where the sunlight lingered gently and added, "I want him to grow up knowing that truth can hurt, but never destroys more than lies. I want him to see the faces of his grandparents and understand that making mistakes is part of being human, but hiding them isn't an option." David came up and hugged her from behind. No one said a word for a moment, because in that suspended instant, pain became legacy transformed. If you've stayed with us until now, you might be feeling something hard to name. Maybe you've revisited an old wound, or maybe you've glimpsed a kind of healing. Either way, know this: you're not alone. Share in the comments what this story stirred in you. Send it to someone who needs to remember that the past doesn't have to be a sentence. Subscribe to the channel. Every week, we bring real stories that cut deep, heal wide, and transform, because everyone deserves a second chance. Everyone deserves to rebuild with their own hands, and everyone deserves to belong exactly as they are.